So I was sitting here, getting ready for bed, thinking about what I was going to wear to the Mean Girls movie tomorrow. I had planned to wear the classic Regina George flare jeans with the off the shoulder black top look with the little pink mini purse. It's a classic. And then I thought to myself, I really wish I had a pleated skirt, and it'd be nice if it was pink. And then I remembered Regina George wears a pleated pink skirt. And then I remembered I have some pink sheets that are just sitting there ready to be used for a project, so I thought, it's only 10 o'clock. I can make a skirt before tomorrow. So I did. Alright, so after my brilliant decision to start making a skirt at 10 o'clock at night, I watched a couple tutorial videos on YouTube for inspiration, and then the first thing I did was measure my waist, hips, and the distance between my waist and hips, which determines how long the tight part of the skirt will be before the pleats separate and get, as I like to say, swishy. Once I had the dimensions, I multiplied my waist length by 3 and then added 2 inches for seam allowance and a bit of room for error. I then figured out how long I wanted the skirt to be. I decided on 18 inches, which hit about 3 to 4 inches above my knee. I think if I was going to do it again, I would either do shorter so it's more of a mini skirt or longer so it's more like a knee length skirt because I felt like the 18 inches ended up being kind of an awkward length. That being said, just measure the length of your favorite skirt or hold up a tape measure in the mirror to decide what length works best for you, and then make sure to add seam allowance if needed. For this skirt, since I happen to have a pink sheet and no other pink fabric, I used the sheet and made sure to measure the skirt along the side that was already hemmed. If you don't use pre-hemmed fabric, you'll need to always allow for seam allowance and make sure you hem all of the raw edges. Once you know the length and width of your skirt, yes, we're creating a giant rectangle. You're going to measure out the pleats along one side of the length of your rectangle. I marked my pleats with chalk and made them about 1.5 inches wide. If you use 1.5 inches, you should end up with the correct amount of pleats so that the skirt matches your original waist length once you're done marking. That being said, if you want larger or smaller pleats than 1.5 inches, I'm sure there's some kind of math you can do to figure out based on whatever waist size you are, however many pleats you need based on the size of the pleats. However, as established in my Evermore video, I am not good at math. If I was, I would have a math channel instead of a sewing channel. So my recommendation would be the classic trial and error method where you just kind of pin them in place and repin them until it looks good and it's what you want it to look like. Once your pleats are marked on one side, you're going to cut out your giant rectangle of fabric and then mark the other side of the skirt opposite the side you just marked. Your markings should be 1.5 inches apart and they should match up so you could draw straight lines across your fabric to make stripes, if you wanted to. I also forgot to mention, but I started my first mark 2 inches from the edge and then left about 2 inches. This was for the seam allowance I mentioned at the beginning, and as I said before, the math should work out for 2 inches on either side and the right amount of pleats if you mark 1.5 inch pleats. Once the pleat measurements are marked on both sides, you're going to pin the pleats in place. Pin the pleats in place. Pin the pleats in place. That is quite a tongue twister. Anyways, this part is kind of hard to explain, so I'm going to show you in slow-mo a couple of times while I attempt to explain. So starting with the first mark on the top edge of your fabric, you're going to pinch the fabric on the chalk mark, then fold the fabric over so it matches up with the third mark. That's right, you're going to skip over the second mark. Once you're done, you should have a fold that is 1.5 inches wide and triple layered in fabric. Once you get the hang of the skirt origami, you're going to do the same thing at the bottom of the skirt, starting with your first pleat mark. Once you're done, you should have a straight fold that goes all the way down the length of your skirt. You could pin the whole top in place and then go back and pin the bottom, but I found it was easier to go top than bottom for pinning each pleat. Also, you will see that I had to redo my pleats because I realized I measured wrong along the bottom. Tends to happen when you're distracted by the TV show you're binging while you're pinning, so I had to remeasure and then repin to make sure my pleats were straight. I would advise that you focus and make sure they're straight the first time because going through and repinning them is super annoying. Once all your pleats are pinned, you're going to iron them down so they stay in place without the pins. You are then going to lay your skirt flat and mark a line from the top of the skirt to whatever that measurement from your hips to your waist was. For me, it was 6 inches, and I think 6 to 8 inches is kind of the average length for most pleated skirts, but that's the beauty of making it yourself. You can customize it however you want. Once that line is marked, you may remove the pins along the bottom of the skirt, but make sure to leave in the ones along the top. You are going to repin all the pleats along the line by moving them 1/2 inch over to allow room for the curve of your hips. This step isn't entirely necessary, but it will give your skirt a bit more shape. Once you're done repinning at the 6-inch line, you're going to sew all the pleats down by following the line from where the top is pinned to where the 6-inch line is pinned. Make sure you do not sew past the 6-inch line and that you backstitch on both sides of your pleat lines. You'll notice I opted for a bright pink thread that will match the button I chose to close the skirt, but you can always opt for a thread that matches the color of your skirt so your pleat sew lines are less visible. Once the pleats are sewed down, it's time to make the waistband. My sheet had a thick section that was already hemmed and a nice width, so I cut a piece of that was the length of my waist measurement plus seam allowance and allowance for the buttonhole, about 4 inches extra than my waist measurement. The width I made 4 inches because we're gonna fold it in half, so that'll give me a 2-inch waistband to end. Now, normally when you're making a waistband, you wanna figure out how thick you want it to be, multiply that by 4 so that you have a double-sided waistband once you fold the edges in, meaning your final waistband would be 2 layers thick on both sides, 4 layers thick in total. But again, that's a lot of math, so if you can find fabric that's already hemmed so that you don't have to worry about figuring all that out, it's always a better option. Once the waistband was cut, I went ahead and folded it in half, good sides together and wrong sides facing out, and then sewed down one side to create a hem on the inside of the waistband. Leave the other side open for now because you'll hem it shut when you attach it to the skirt. You will then turn your waistband right sides out and use something, like a stick, to sharpen the corner of the edge you just hemmed. You will then iron the waistband so it has a nice sharp edge following the fold determined by the hem you just created. Once it's ironed, take the hemmed side of your waistband and line it up with the hemmed side of the edge of your skirt and pin the skirt inside the waistband. You'll want to make sure the top of your skirt is as close to the top of the fold of your waistband as possible. You're then going to sew along the bottom of the waistband to attach the skirt. You will also hem the edge of the waistband that we left open by flipping the edge under about a 1/2 inch and sewing along the edge. You'll notice that when I got to the edge of my waistband, there was a bit more skirt than my waist size. That was intentional, and you'll see why later on. You'll also notice that the fabric extending past my waistband was raw, so I went ahead and zigzag stitched along the top edge so it wouldn't fray. It would have been better to serge or hem the fabric, but I don't actually have a serger and there wasn't enough room for the hem since it was already sewn into the waistband. Now you're thinking, this is all well and good, but this is still a rectangle and not a skirt. Have no fear. You are now going to take the edge of your skirt that is not hemmed, iron a double fold hem, then sew the hem down. You are then going to match up the 2 edges of your pleated rectangle, good sides together and wrong sides facing out. Once the sides are matched up and pinned, you will sew up the edge of your skirt till about 7 to 8 inches from the top of the skirt, following the stitch line of the hem you just made. This will create the skirt while leaving an opening from the waistband to, like I said, 7 to 8 inches down, that allows you to get the skirt on and off. Please note that if you got a big booty or really wide hips, you may need to allow more of a hole than 7 to 8 inches. Now, normally you would want to do a zipper closure on your skirt because it looks nicer and it's a little less breezy, if you know what I mean. But I did not have any spare zippers on hand, and unfortunately the store is not open at 2 in the morning, so we went ahead and went with the button closure option, which is fine. And if you like that look, you should totally do it. But my recommendation would be, if you're making this at a reasonable hour, buy a zipper. To create the button closure, you should try the skirt on and mark where you want the skirt to attach. You will then sew the button onto the part of the skirt that you want to be on the inside. In our case, this will be the side of the skirt that has the extra fabric sticking out from the waistband. Once the button is sewn on, you will cut a hole in the other end of the waistband that is big enough to fit your button through. And then normally you would use the buttonhole maker on your sewing machine, but I don't actually know how to set it up on my machine and my brain was not working at this point, so I went ahead and hemmed the buttonhole using embroidery thread, similar to what I did in my Barbie pants video for the eyelets of my pants. Once the buttonhole was complete, the skirt was ready to go, and you'll see that the extra fabric we left is to prevent there being a gaping hole where the opening of the skirt is once you button the waistband. And finally, the last step is to wash the skirt since there are chalk markings all over it, and sadly washing the skirt did destroy all of my pleats since the sheet fabric I used is not very stiff. So I had to re-iron all the pleats once the skirt was washed and dried, but then it was ready to go. So as you can see from the reveal footage, this fabric is not great for this type of skirt because it gets wrinkled really easily, like literally just got wrinkled from me walking around in it. So I would say if you're gonna make this skirt, definitely pick a fabric that does not wrinkle easily and also is less see-through because obviously sheet fabric that's light is kind of see-through. So pro tips if you're actually gonna make it.